It's the middle of the night in Utah, and a young woman is making her way home from a bar. The date is November 1982. She had a couple of drinks, but nothing too crazy, and she feels fine to drive. But as she's driving, a car pulls up next to hers and flashes their high beams. So she pulls over to the side of the road to see what's up. Ash! And when she does, a man jumps out of the other vehicle and runs over to hers. He starts banging on the window and screaming at her and demanding that she'd get out of the car. And he tells her that he wants her car. She eventually complies and gets out of the vehicle, and the guy gets into hers and drives off. But this is where things get crazy. The guy ends up crashing the car and then running away from the scene. Police found her car abandoned a few minutes away from where it was taken, and they found the victim's purse and some of her clothes nearby as well. And they also found a bunch of blood, but they didn't find her. She was nowhere to be seen. It would be days later before her body would turn up along the side of a road, and police believe that she was strangled by the man who took her car, but they never did catch him. No one had any leads and the case went cold. And for a long time it looked like this would just be another unsolved case of a brutal murder in Utah. That is until recently. Because 40 years later, we now know who this monster really was. So join me as we look back at this disturbing case and how after all these years, someone was finally brought to justice. So this terrifying crime took place in 1982 in Springville, Utah. A 25-year-old woman named Brenda Groberg left her house around 6:30 p.m. to go meet some friends at a local bar. She had been drinking heavily for the last 2 weeks to cope with some problems in her life. Her father had passed away not even a month earlier, and her mother was now in hospice care. In addition to that, she was recently divorced and had lost custody of her son, and so she was just trying to drown her sorrows at the bar. But the only problem was that she drank way too much that night. And as she started driving home, she ended up falling asleep behind the wheel. And as we mentioned, that's when she was awoken up by some bright lights flashing her way. She pulled over to the side of the road to see what was going on, and this is when a man jumped out of the other vehicle and ran over to her window and banged on it and demanded that she let him in. And she actually initially thought that this was a dream. Like she thought, why is this guy banging on my window? But when she realized that this was actually happening, she got pretty scared. She started yelling at him to get away from her, but that didn't do anything, and so she started driving away. But when he ran over to the other side of the car and started hitting on that window. So she stopped the car again and rolled down the window and asked him what he wanted. And that's when he told her that he wanted her car. She tried to tell him that she wasn't going to give him her car, but he forced his way in, while she was still sitting in the driver's seat, and pushed her out of the vehicle, and then he sped away. Brenda then somehow managed to flag down another motorist who gave her a ride to a nearby gas station. And that's when she called the police and reported her car stolen. She was then taken home by the police because she was visibly drunk, and they figured that she was too intoxicated to take care of herself. But it would be hours later that the police would discover that she had actually been murdered. They found her body about 3 miles away from her home near a riverbed. She had been strangled with a pair of pantyhose. And right away, police knew that they needed to find whoever had taken her car, because they believed that this same person was responsible for her death. But unfortunately, there was zero evidence to go on. The police did have a composite sketch of the suspect, which was based on an eyewitness account of a man who saw the struggle between Brenda and the abductor. But they never received any tips on his identity, and so the case went cold. For several months, Brenda's sister Pammy believed that the police weren't doing enough to find her sister's killer, and so she even offered a $5,000 reward to anyone who could help crack the case. But even this didn't lead them to the killer. Fast forward to 2015, though, and new technology would actually allow police to reopen the investigation. Back in 2015, the police submitted the preserved blood sample they had collected from the crime scene to a lab. They processed it and were able to get a DNA profile of the suspect. But obviously, this still didn't solve anything. It just had a DNA profile, but nobody to compare it to. But then in 2018, the police decided to try something different. They uploaded the DNA profile to a website called GEDmatch, which is a free genealogy website where people can upload the DNA. profiles of their relatives to see if they can learn more about their family tree. The police were hoping that maybe someone out there had taken a DNA test to trace their ancestry, and that perhaps they could find a match with this database. And it actually worked. They found a distant relative of the killer who had uploaded their own DNA profile to the site. This distant relative turned out to be a 71-year-old man named Gary Sheets. Police visited his house and asked him if he would be willing to give them a DNA sample to compare to the evidence, but Gary refused. He told them that he didn't want to get involved in this. The police obtained a search warrant, and they ended up finding Gary's discarded water bottle and soda can from his garbage bins outside. They then took these to the lab, and they were able to extract his DNA from them, and it matched the DNA from the crime scene. Now, the police went back to Gary's house, and they finally convinced him to come in for questioning. He agreed to take a DNA test, which confirmed that he was a match to the evidence. And they also discovered that he had prior convictions for sexual assault. And so police knew that they finally had their man. Gary would later admit to committing the crime, said that he had been struggling financially, and that's why he needed a new car. He said that he chose Brenda specifically because she was a young woman, and he figured that she would comply with whatever he said. And he also confessed to killing several other women during the same time frame, although police have only been able to link him to one other murder. In July of 2021, Gary appeared in court. He was so ashamed for his actions that he actually begged the judge for mercy. He said, "I am so sorry for what I did to Brenda Groberg and her family. There's not a day that goes by that I do and think about what I did to her. I pray for her and her family constantly." He also claimed that he had no memory of the incident, but that he remembered being desperate for money. Unfortunately, he was already 71 years old, and so this meant that he likely wouldn't make it out alive. He was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Now, this is where things get a little weird. About a month later, Gary died in prison of unknown causes. And so, in the end, justice was served, but it was a bit anticlimactic. Still, it was nice for Brenda's family to finally get some closure after 40 years. This was the first murder in Utah to be solved using this type of genetic genealogy method. And so this has opened the door for many other cold cases to be reopened. Since the introduction of GED match in 2010, 15 people have been convicted of murder using this method across the United States. And this shows us just how powerful DNA testing can be. Even decades after a crime, DNA evidence can still be used to bring a killer to justice. And in many ways, this makes us very lucky that we live in the age of science that we do. If this case had happened just a few decades earlier, then we may never have known what happened to Brenda or who was responsible for taking her life. Thank you for watching.